The theme that shines through in all the readings of today is what God can accomplish in sinful, weak, mortal human beings because of God's graciousness and might, and if they allow God to do what God has to do. Isaiah, though sinful and weak, became one of the greatest of the Old Testament prophets after being touched by God. Saul, who was a persecutor of those who followed Jesus, and so of Jesus himself, became Paul and one of the most influential figures in Christianity after Jesus. Peter, who even after being chosen by Jesus and regarded in the lifetime of Jesus as the leader of the group of the disciples, denied Jesus when it mattered most, and yet he became one of the founding pillars of the church which Jesus had instituted. What shines forth in these three individuals who figure in the readings of today is their awareness of their own unworthiness and consequently of their dependence on God and on God's magnanimous eternal grace. In the first reading of today, Isaiah is afraid that because he is a sinner and lives among sinners, there is no hope for him. Yet, with a simple and a single touch, all his sins are wiped clean, and he becomes the one whom God will send to his people. He will send Isaiah not because Isaiah is without sin, but precisely because Isaiah is a sinner. And Isaiah, the sinner, will tell God's people about God's unconditional mercy and love, a mercy and love that he has experienced in his sinfulness, and the mercy and love which everyone can also experience in their sinfulness. This is also the experience of Paul, who speaks in his letter to the Corinthians of the revelation made to him. On the one hand, Paul considers himself as most unworthy to have received any kind of revelation from the Lord, simply because he had closed himself to God's grace. On the other hand, however, he was the one to whom God revealed a great deal, because Paul realized his own inadequacy, his own weakness. The revelation of the risen Lord made Paul aware of what God could do in and through him, and even in his weakness, if only he allowed God to work in his life. This revelation of unworthiness and the realization of this unworthiness and the conferring of God's grace find a beautiful and classic description in the gospel text of today. Peter had done nothing to merit the call of Jesus or to have him sit and teach from his boat. As in the case of Isaiah and Paul, it had to do with divine choice, the choice of God. God's call and God's choice are unpredictable. It can come at any time. It can come to anyone. You and I cannot determine to whom that call might come. We, on our part, can only be open to receive that call, like Paul and Isaiah were, like Peter was, and like our Blessed Mother Mary teaches us constantly. Secondly, the call to discipleship in the case of Peter did not come in a holy place like a temple, nor did it come with great fanfare. The call came when Peter was engaged in daily life, when Peter was engaged in providing for himself and for his family, when Peter was engaged, you might say, in his employment. This point is significant, not because God does not call people in a holy place, but because it is a further sign of the work of God's kingdom reaching into the arena of human life. God is not to be found only in the temple. God is to be found at every single moment, and God is to be found often in the mundane, the routine, and the ordinary. The point is significant because God's kingdom is a kingdom which must be proclaimed not only in a church, in a mosque, in a temple, in a gurudwara, or in any other religious place, but God's kingdom must be proclaimed in our own lives and in the lives of others. Luke, by stating that although they had fished all night, they had caught nothing, is probably indicating the consequences of any kind of enterprise that does not have the Lord at its center. This allows an opportunity for Luke to show both the success of the activity which is done on the word of Jesus, and to narrate the commission that Peter is given, the mission in which he will henceforth be engaged. Peter's protest of his sinfulness and unworthiness must touch the lives of each one of us. We also, like Peter, are sinners. We also, like Peter, are unworthy, and we need to acknowledge that. And when we do, it will be negated by the ability of Jesus to fill us, like he filled Peter, with all that we need to become a fisher of people, to inspire people about this unconditional love of God. God's grace conferred on Isaiah, Paul, and Peter is effective. It brings forth what it promises. In the case of Isaiah, it results in blotting out his sin and making him an efficacious instrument of God's word. In the case of Paul, grace is responsible for the conversion of Saul into Paul and for the unimaginable breadth of Paul's ministry. It seemed at that time that there was not a single person whom Paul's letters and preaching may not have touched. In the case of Peter, it results in both the realization of the consequences of his denial and a renewed commitment to the Lord who first invited him. The voice of God that echoed in the heavenly court at the time of Isaiah, the bolt of lightning that struck Paul down, and the voice of Jesus that called Peter continues to ask, "Whom shall I send?" This is because, though God is all powerful and omnipotent, God does not work alone, but continues to work in and through weak and sinful human beings. We can decide to respond to this invitation in a variety of ways. One way is to ignore it completely and pretend that we have not heard it. This response allows us to continue to do what we are comfortable doing, to live our regular, mundane, ordinary lives. Another response is to give a false sense of humility and think that it could never be us who are called by God, because we are incapable or not talented enough or not holy enough. That also would be an inadequate response. A third response is to realize that the voice is calling me, but to pay no heed to it because the task ahead is too daunting and we do not trust God enough, like in this time of the pandemic. It is to hear the voice of God and to ignore it, pretend that we have not heard it. However, there is also the way of Isaiah, Paul, and Peter. It is to hear the voice, realize our own unworthiness, and even as we acknowledge this, to know that we will engage in mission, not on our own, not on our own steam and strength and talents and abilities, but with God who goes ahead of us, guiding our path and lighting our way. It is to know that though we are of unclean lips and unclean hearts, a touch of the Lord can make us clean and whole. It is to know that the grace of God is with us at all times. It is to know that with the Lord by our side, we too, like Peter, like Paul, can become fishers of men and women. We too, like Isaiah, can proclaim this unconditional, magnanimous, and eternal love of God. Will you acknowledge your own unworthiness? Hear God heal that and make you whole, and become a prophet of God's kingdom today.